Thinking Aloud. Conversations on the leading edge of knowledge and discovery with psychologist Jeffrey Mishlove.
Hello and welcome. I'm Jeffrey Mishlove. Today we'll be exploring commoning, a concept to which I was just introduced by our guest, Andy Hilton. We've done a couple of interviews with Andy already on his book, Anthropology and Mysticism and the Making of Initiation. Now we're going to look at a book that he was a co-editor of called Perspectives on Commoning. Welcome once again, Andy.
Thank you.
It's a pleasure to be with you. I have to admit, I'd never heard the term commoning until I saw it there in your book cover. But we had an interesting conversation, and I'm inclined to think that it's a very important concept. Now, I know the origins are very political, so why don't we start there and we'll get into it.
Yeah, and as a verb form and the gerund form commoning, that's not so common. The origins come from the English commons, the common land which was set aside in the feudal system for the use of villagers for grazing sheep, commonly in the center of the village. So there's a central public area or an area that everybody has access to, the right of usage. That's the origin of common goods. The idea was forwarded by Thomas Paine, which will relate to the history of this country. The idea of common goods continued and was developed. Also, the idea of common access and of usage of a user group was developed. And in Europe, there was the leftist workerism, autonomist political leftist current that developed the idea of the worker as the leading edge of change and transformation for a fairer society, based on their common rights. We could put it like that.
Mm-hmm. The union movement, for example.
Yeah, indeed. Yeah, but the union movement is led by the union leaders, which may tend to have an investment in making deals with the bosses and leaving the people behind. So that's another issue of how workerism came through. And more recently, in that thrust, which is the leftist thrust, there was a very well known trilogy of works, the Empire Trilogy. Antonio Negri is the foremost name. There's a whole school involved, and that trilogy was co-written. But he's the one that you would pick most on as a writer, as an influential writer. That's in that tradition.
The Empire Trilogy. We're not talking fiction, I assume.
We're not. No. So Empire represents power, and in opposition to the multitude. So we got the multitude is the mass. It's an alternative name, a new name you could say for the mass. That's also critiqued because there is no multitude. There are many multitudes, and one goes on into the theory in that direction. Mm-hmm. Power can be also equated with capital. So the common is opposed to capital as a system of organization, as a system of production and reproduction of all goods, including services, public goods, all kinds. And it's a very alternative and oppositional approach So one has power, which is the empire, in opposition to the common and the multitudes.
Mm-hmm. Well, I'm under the impression, since the origin of the word goes back to medieval villages,
right? Yeah,
we're in a feudal system, which is about as hierarchical as they come. Mm-hmm. That even in that system, there is an effort for average people to pool their resources and in a beneficial way.
Yeah, that's the idea. That's the idea. And then going back to the American tradition, user groups would be groups of people who use a resource, who collectively organize, manage, produce, reproduce that resource, be it water supplies in Northern California, or the policing of a city-state. It could be a range of things. So that's a service provision.
And here in the information age, the concept of user groups is one I'm very familiar with. I use certain software packages. For a while, I've been very active in various financial forecasting software packages, where the user groups would take a particular piece of software developed by a corporation, typically, but then the user groups would really expand the use of it. They would find uses that the developers typically hadn't really thought of yet. And the community of users became an integral part of the further development of the software product.
Right. And would they be monetizing that development?
Not well, except by sharing their insights amongst each other.
So they're not monetizing it, so they're not commodifying it, so they're keeping it out of the realm of capital. Yeah. So it's a genuine commoning activity that they're engaged in, a sharing of information, and information is another form of goods that can be commoned.
Well, for example, we live in an information age. Take this video channel.
Exactly. This is a common resource.
It is. I mean, it is monetized in the sense that there's advertising. I try to keep it to a minimal amount, but there's a community of users who comment, and oftentimes the direction of the programming is influenced by the user community.
In this case, there's no particular restriction on the user group, so that's an interesting variation in a classical model. Right, in a classical model, the user group would be fairly well specified. For example, the villagers. The people living in the territory. In the virtual example, there's no specification like that, so it's an open-bordered user group.
Half of our viewers are scattered around the world. About half of them are American citizens.
Yeah, that would be expected. Yeah. There's no definition as to what that should be.
No.
Right.
There's no restriction in terms of age or sex or sexual orientation or race. In fact, many of the users, probably most of the users, don't use their real names. They have YouTube names that they use. So I have no idea
it doesn't really
about
matter,
their ethnicity or their and anything of that sort, but it forms a community.
Yeah, and then you get into the idea of a community of users. What is a community? In the sense of virtual information sharing, it's a very nebulous thing. People may come and go. Yep. You don't actually know the identities. You never meet except the communication online, and you might be communicating with, well, you don't know who you communicate. Yeah.
No, but sometimes those communications are prolonged over years. There are users who have been with this channel for years.
They can be very intense and very intimate and very informative and very real. Yeah.
And there is a common link which has to do with the paranormal and the mystical experience, which is the central thread of all of our videos. Not particularly this discussion, but it seems to me that when you're dealing with the mystical, it touches on every other subject.
Okay.
Would you agree?
I'm not quite sure where you're going with that, but It's interesting to relate the idea of a common pool of knowledge or a common informational sharing with an idea of collective consciousness. That may work in some way, possibly. Yeah.
Well, I bring it up because there are issues. Political issues, really, around globalism, around nationalism, around the rise of right-wing thinking. There's a rise of authoritarian right-wing leaders, not only in Europe and the United States, but in the Philippines and India. China has issues of authoritarianism.
One or two.
And it seems to me that commoning, in the various forms that it takes, is I don't know if I'd call it an antidote, but maybe a complement to the rise of authoritarian structures in our culture.
It's essentially based on the people taking their own power, working together, sharing. So it's a bottom-up kind of principle. Yeah. It doesn't depend on the hierarchy of power. So it's intrinsically liberal, I would say. In that sense, in the political framing, it can speak to the libertarian conservative as well as the leftist, not socialist. It's not public versus private. It's beyond public versus private. It's not state socialist versus libertarian. It's more, it goes beyond traditional left-right dichotomy, I think.
Well, I understand that the anthology that you edited had some of its origins in Italian Marxism.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah, and so it certainly does speak to and come from those radical leftist roots.
Now, I gather that your anthology, your co-editor is really the person pushing the concept, and your work as the editor was largely involved in making it read well in the English language.
Yeah, and giving a structure to the volume. Yeah, Guido was definitely, it's his project, and he invited me to help, and I got involved, and I thought it's a wonderful idea, and I do think it's a model going forward, a complement to capital and to capitalism. I don't see it as necessarily a rival or an antagonistic relationship, but I do see that it can have a great future, the idea of commoning, sharing, in relation to the earlier conversations with initiation. It's what young people do all the time. Young people are always sharing stuff because young people don't have so much money. It's common to do that. It's natural to do that. People get together. That's a collective action. It goes with co-ops. There's a long co-op movement also. It can also work if and insofar as we develop basic income, which is a happening idea and growing in various places in the world. If we don't have if we have sufficient production and surplus value that we don't have specific needs to support ourselves at a very basic level, because there is already basic income, that is, everybody is guaranteed a certain level of income, and basic food, for that matter, is one of the chapters in the book. Somebody advocates basic food. We have enough wealth in the world for everybody to have a basic level of food provided. If we go towards those systems, towards a realization of a future utopic, it may be that we can increasingly work together without needing to earn money. We won't have the same need, although there will always be that motivation to rise above and to acquire, of course. Yeah.
Well, right now, I hope that this video has a life well beyond the present moment. But at this moment, there's a presidential campaign going on, and one of the candidates for the Democratic nomination for the U.S. presidency, Andrew Yang, an entrepreneur, someone with a business background, is proposing a minimum income.
Right,
$1,000 a month for every American.
Okay, that's an American. There's where was it? I forget the region, but it may have been coming in one region in India. There's been trials of various kinds. There's one going on in Utrecht, I think, in the Netherlands. There's been something in Africa. The UNDP, United Nations Development Programme, has found that the best way to boost development of a region is just to supply, of a poor region, is just to supply a basic income to the whole population, and they do with it as they will. That's an input from outside, an external input. But for a relatively small amount, you get a lot of takeaway, shall we say? It's an idea that's really is growing. It does seem to be some kind of adolescent ideal, but it seems it isn't. It seems very real, and it could be a growing phenomenon.
You know, as I recall, Andrew Yang, I'm not an Andrew Yang supporter, but I see when he appears, he wears a little lapel button that says math.
Okay.
On it, like do the math.
You do the math. Okay, it works. Yeah, this isn't pie in the sky. This is quite real and realistic. Yeah, and it may be an idea whose time is coming. Yeah.
You know, an idea whose time has come reminds me of back in the days when Werner Erhard, the Est movement, was popular in the United States. He talked about ending starvation as an idea whose time has come. And back in those days, I haven't checked the statistics lately. Back in those days, I believe 30 million people a year in this planet died of starvation, although there was always enough food to feed everyone. Right.
And that continues. There's still enough food to feed everyone. There's an awful lot more people now. There's still enough food it's a distribution issue. It's an economics issue. Yeah. There's no reason why we can't solve these problems if we want to. There has been tremendous developments through neoliberalism in Southeast Asia. There tends to be a desire in the West to attack neoliberalism these days for understandable reasons, because it kind of leaves people behind when the factory gets moved to China or to India. But in the Southeast Asia, millions, maybe 1 billion people have been pulled out of poverty through it. So we need to look at the positive side of the developments going on.
And by neoliberalism, it sounds like you're referring to international trade and the shifting of manufacturing to that area of Asia.
Yeah, the mobility of capital, specifically, the mobility of information, we see that ongoing. The mobility of people, that's problematic. That proves problematic.
Now, I would like to take this to a little bit of a deeper level with you, and I know you raised a fascinating idea when you said if we look inside, each of us has within us every political position. We all have an inner fascist, an inner communist, an inner conservative, an inner liberal, and an inner anarchist.
I like to play with that idea. I think it's in general, we talk about pluralism as a macro political, but we can talk about it psychologically, that we all have these different, like a graphic equalizer. We have them. We identify with one range, but we have all of them. Yep. It's just a question of the balance of them. It's important to recognize that we all are conservative. We all are inherently liberal. We do all have that fascist inside of us. We all like to come together and act collectively. There's nothing like a group feeling. We all have these different aspects, but we tend to identify tribally with one in particular, as though the others are mortal enemies.
So the idea of commoning could be thought of as a coming together of people all across the spectrum.
And a user group can easily encompass a wide variety of views and perspectives. Why not?
So and now we've talked about in the high-tech area, user groups and software. You've talked about sharing water resources. I gather in many urban communities, now you see the idea of urban gardens.
Yeah. And housing, that will go with cooperative housing schemes. Indeed, yeah. There's no limit to what can be commoned. Anything that has value, that can be owned and thus regarded as capital, can also be shared and thus commoned. And the biggest commoning institution is the family. It's pretty common for families to operate as a shared resource.
Yeah.
And that's a basis of commoning that is all over the world. We do it anyways. Yeah.
Well, I think this is a fascinating excursion. It seems to me, in the larger political sense, many people are globalists, and I consider myself a globalist in the sense that I think it's very important for people to realize we share this planet, and there are problems on the planet that need to be addressed at a planet-wide level.
Well, I 100% agree with you. Globalism took on a negative connotation, and I understand in America a globalist has a negative connotation.
Well, not by me.
Right, okay, in the public discourse.
There seems to be, I would say, a tension between people who consider themselves nationalists, like put America first.
Yeah, sure.
As opposed to globalists, like let's put the planet first.
Yeah, indeed. And nationalism has been a very powerful force for a couple of 100 years, and it's got some good aspects. Nothing is all bad, of course, but it's also got a lot of problems, a lot of issues, and one would hope to identify as a human being and a globalist before one identifies with one's own particular ethno-national territorial grouping.
And my sense is that even amongst people who dislike globalism, like I know there are a number of viewers who explain to me that the very phrase New World Order strikes a terror in their hearts. And I think what they're afraid of is that some sort of authoritarian fascist regime is going to assume control over a planetary order and force people to say things or do things or think things even that it would be a curb on individual freedom. But I gather that in this commoning movement, people don't feel that their freedoms are being curbed.
Right. Whether they feel that or not, that rather depends on the specifics. In terms of New World Order, yeah, I mean, that's a hugely loaded phrase. From a leftist perspective, the New World Order is the order of capital, is the order of the multinational, is the order of the transnational private corporation that has more power than the individual state. The danger goes in that direction. I don't know how the conservative sees that kind of argument, but from the leftist perspective, we are dangerously close to the New World Order already.
Yeah. Well, and I think that many people on the conservative end of the spectrum feel much the same.
Okay.
Although some of them are concerned about, maybe some sort of communistic kind of takeover. I don't know. Everybody has a different fear.
Yeah.
Some people are afraid it's the Jews who are going to take over.
Still.
I get that.
Yeah.
Other people are afraid it's the women who are going to take over. Other people think it's going to be the Catholics. Other people are concerned about the Muslims.
So what's going on there? We're projecting onto a single group power, and we're like giving away or feeling our sense of powerlessness. So there's a distance from power that the ordinary person is feeling, and that's reasonable because in the large scale setup that we have of nation states where power resides in the capital and within that a very small group, and we call those elites nowadays, and that has many different meanings and connotations depending where you're coming from. People feel very distant from that, and they don't feel like they have power at the local level, and commoning certainly works from the bottom up in the sense of power in the community. So we get the common is the community, which can be a local level, and works upwards from there.
Well, that is seems to make sense to me, that if we're going to have a kind of organic globalism, it needs to be bottom up and not top down.
Yeah, and to that one might add, it needs to be peopled by mature human beings. It's only going to be as effective and flourish as healthily as possible insofar as the people filling the positions of the community members are good people acting in the community interest. So it also relates to the ethical level, ethical operation of people, and we see a lot of bad ethics at the moment, I think. And also, you could also bring in the paranormal. You could bring that in and say that a richer experience, a better human being is one who works more with intuition, who is more attuned to the needs of the whole. And that does have a connection, I believe, with Psi and paranormal. I do believe that we're cutting ourselves off from a range of experience, and there are indications that we may, in the West, be opening up to that again, and that is a naturally connecting force, which goes very nicely with commoning and sharing.
Well, in our previous discussion on the psychology of initiation, we brought up the concept of cosmic consciousness.
Right.
And it seems to me it's not unrelated to your interest in commoning.
Right. Yeah. It's hard to be a nationalist once you've got God. How are you thinking of the connection?
Well, I can't be too specific.
Right.
Ironically, I mean, I know that as people awaken,
okay,
they find that they share a kind of heart connection with other awakened people.
Yeah, and then we're also getting into the issue of where we are going and what's going on in the world. Is there an awakening going on? Is that a mass? Is that going into a mass phenomenon, or is it a very localized concern that has always been the case? There's nothing new nothing new under the sun. It's always been there. It just seems more so because the population's bigger, so there's more people to connect with. We connect better against that kind of like realism, like let's not get ahead of ourselves. Yeah, maybe there is some kind of awakening going on, and maybe we are upgrading on our genetic capabilities. Even that idea is out there. It's possible, yeah.
Well, many years ago, I interviewed the philosopher Michael Grosso. Can't quite remember the name of his book, but his point was simply this, that people are awakening. Yeah. And the reason it's expressed in things like these UFO contacts, such as you yourself have experienced, right. Near-death experiences coming up more in our culture, mystical experiences, the psychedelic human potential movement. Those are all examples of awakening, but it is occurring more dramatically now because we're facing the prospect of the potential extinction of the human race at our own hands.
Yeah, well, it's an extreme view to consider that we're facing extinction of the human race, but that's not the most extreme view. A more extreme view is that we're facing extinction of the mammalian category, that there is a name for this, the era of mammal, that we're going back to pre-mammal. That's a little bit more extreme. Yeah, at the same time as we got this opening out of a potential utopic future, relatively utopic, because in respect of the past, we're already in a utopia, that we got so much that it was unimaginable a couple of 100 years ago. At the same time as that, we're going into this dystopian. You related it to the current politics, but more profoundly is the ecological situation, and we really don't know how bad it may get.
I think many people suggest we're right now in the middle of one of the largest extinctions in the history of this planet. I've heard it called the fifth or the sixth extinction.
Yeah, you're talking about life forms in general. Yeah, I mean, there's like, and that we're talking about eco-collapse, the potential of eco-collapse. It seems to me a real potential, and quite what that means we'll find out as we go along. Currently, we're on target according to the demographic graph. We're on target for 12 billion human population in something like 50 years. So we're on 8 and we're looking to 12. So we got another 50% rise of humans on this planet. That's the projection. Will we get there? Are we going to get to like kind of 10 billion and then we're going to have such bad things happening in Chile or Australia where there's already some major issues? Or are we going to suddenly plummet when we go over thresholds of methane release and we get to real chaotic apocalyptic situations and the world's population is left at a couple of billion? That's another scenario. We're playing out scenarios here. At the moment, it's easy to be alarmist, and it's probably not inappropriate to be quite alarmist.
Well, I'm not suggesting that we should be alarmist. I'm suggesting that the proper response is a kind of awakening.
Well, yeah, at the same time, yeah, indeed. I say the word alarmist not as an accusation, but also that any change always needs a cutting edge. And so we do need that alarmism. We need that fear of how bad it could be in order to move us. Because at the moment, we're not really budging very fast. We got the Greta's going around on her ship and that, but, she will say that she's a failure. And we've got to agree that, it's not really changing. If we're looking at, global greenhouse gas emissions, if we look at that specific issue, I mean, they're rising. We're going past our targets, and we can see the whole thing really failing quite badly at the moment.
So faced with this situation, and people will disagree about the particulars for sure, it does seem to me that on the one hand, some sort of top-down global order is going to be unsatisfactory to a huge number of people. So a kind of bottom-up organic commoning across the planet in various forms, in a multitude of ways, does seem to me to be a viable route.
Yeah, and something intuitive in me says is not happy entirely with that. I can see the two of them. I don't think they necessarily have to be in tension, or they will be in tension, but it doesn't have to be an either or. And it can come from both directions. It's a what did you say? A global world order?
Well, I don't know if I use that phrase.
Whatever the phrasing.
Organic coming together at a global level.
And that can also come with an organic acceptance and relationship with a more holistic ordering. So it's not necessarily either or, bottom up, top down, but I think that emphasizing the role of the power of the ordinary person working bottom up in all kinds of structures, including in political structures, I think it's a good thing.
And perhaps honoring all of the different political personalities within each of us.
That would be necessary as a part of the dynamic. Yeah,
I think so.
Yeah.
Well, Andy Hilton, it's been a delightful conversation.
Yeah, okay.
I don't know if it'll lead anywhere, but I think it's useful for people to begin to think about these issues.
Yeah, I think thinking widely, not getting boxed into to identifying with one position and with one view of how it's going to be. It cannot be. We need to be open because it's an open conversation. We don't really know where we're going. We're not sure where we should go. Things are very much in flux. There's a great sense of chaos, and it does need talking about and opening with open minds and thinking aloud.
Thank you so much for being with me,
Thank
Andy.
you. Cheers.
And thank you for being with us.